And presidential historians have told us often of the isolation of the White House, and each president has devised his own methods for overcoming it, but keeping in touch with opinions and trends around the country. Tonight, an exclusive glimpse at how the Nixon administration is coping with the problem, part one of a three-part series on the subject. Here's WTOP White House correspondent Ford Rowan.
Keeping the president informed of what the public is hearing and reading, what television, newspapers, and magazines are reporting to the American people, is basically the job of one man. He is Patrick J. Buchanan, a special assistant to the president. Buchanan is 31 years old, and he has worked for Mr. Nixon for more than 4 years. During the campaign of 1968, his duties ranged from strategy to speechwriting, and they still do. Before going to work for the Nixon campaign, Buchanan was a newspaper man, and in a sense, he's now back in the newspaper business. Every morning at 8 o'clock, he walks from his working place in the Executive Office Building to the President's Oval Office, delivering to Mr. Nixon's desk the world's most exclusive newspaper, a 4,000 to 10,000 word summary of press and broadcast reports from around the country. Called the President's Daily News Briefing, it is culled from 54 newspapers, scores of magazines, wire service reports, and daily television newscasts. It is marked for the eyes of the President only, though in recent months the circulation has been extended to the Vice President and top White House aides. In an exclusive interview with WTOP commentator Earl Mazo, Buchanan, once an editorial writer for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, discussed his present job as publisher for the President.
Well, the daily news summary consists of about 5 different segments. One segment is the wire service copy from the afternoon and evening of the night before. We will take and condense, summarize the leading stories coming off the wires. The second section is a news digest, which contains digested columns, editorials, and articles from newspapers, some 54 newspapers from around the country, which come in here on a staggered basis. That would be a second section. A third is the television analysis, which is an analysis of the evening television news, what's the lead in the news, how it's played, how the administration has come off in the evening television. A fourth section would be the news top, which would be the section that I would do in the morning between 7 and 8 in the morning. After going over the material in the evening, I would come in the morning and, utilizing some 5 or 6 Eastern papers in addition to the Chicago Tribune, write a news top, which would, in about 500 words, tell the president what was the leading news items of the day before and of that morning, and what the country was thinking about and talking about as they read their morning paper with their morning coffee.
Well, who does all this? I mean, do you read all of this and see and watch all this television?
No, you said I was a publisher of it. That's correct. A publisher doesn't do a great deal of work, and I don't spend full time on this. Actually, the editor of the publication, the Daily News Summary, is Mort Allen, who works in an office across the hall. He's formerly was chairman, national chairman, or rather executive director of Youth for Nixon in the 1968 campaign. He's a high school teacher, I believe history and political science from Wisconsin. Working with him is a young lady who helps him digest and also does the wire tickers, Leslie Arsht. We have 3 of us. I do it, and Tom Houston helps out, who's one of the president's writers, helps out with the TV analysis. And we have a young fellow from American University who does clipping, filing, and some reports for us.
UPI reports that Harris is going to resign effective March 5th so he can devote full time to attacking the president.
Not a marked change in what he's been doing, is there?
On a regular basis also, we have a once-a-week magazine report, which draws on some 20 magazines. The essence of the major articles in the magazine, this is taken, digested into magazine reports, which will generally run about 20 pages, which is included in the president's Wednesday morning summary, which arrives on his desk.
Are these magazines, how about newsletters? I mean, what is the range of them?
Well, I've got a list of magazines that are included here. You've got all your news weeklies, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report.
I don't read them all, but the essence, what's on the left and what's on the right?
And your opinion magazines. You've also got a number of newsletters. The American Conservative Union's newsletters here. Ripon Forum is in here.
That's the Ripon Society?
Ripon Society. I.F. Stone's newsletter is in here. The Evans-Novak newsletter is included. And, of course, National Review, New Republic, Nation, the Journals of Opinion are all included. And it's a pretty comprehensive list. We've even got the British Economist in here as one of the weekly magazines, which we summarize in the President's weekly magazine summary. Here's the President's Daily News Summary for a day or 2 ago, which came back. There's a number of pages missing, which is an indication that the President has written a notation on it. The page has been torn out and served as the basis of an action memo from the president. There's about 11 pages missing in this report. This incidentally contains a number of cartoons, which is again a twice-a-week item. We'll take the best cartoons or the most representative cartoons from papers around the country and paste them up and put them in here. The president, including her block. The president reads him, though, in the Washington Post.
Mr. Buchanan, let me get a little more specific. You say television monitoring. What television do you look at? What do you report?
On a regular basis, 3 of us monitor each of the evening network news shows. We write a report on the network news show, and then we bring that report together and make it a single report on the evening television news. In addition to that, there are TV specials. Mike Wallace's show, 60 Minutes, is one example, first Tuesday. Other examples like that, which are special shows where we'll either tape them or watch the show and do a report for the president on that television show. And these will be in his daily news summary maybe a day or 2 later.
How much time does he devote to reading this?
The president's a very rapid reader. I would think he could get through even the longest of these reports. We've got it broken down into headlines so he can read issues that concern him. I would think he spends 20 minutes a day on this report, and in addition to that, of course, he reads 2, 3, 4 newspapers a day himself. In terms of newspapers, I recall one morning when I came down to begin the news summary, I got there about 6:30 and picked up the papers myself, 6 or 7 of them, from a newsstand over on 15th Street, and the fellow said, "You're 15 minutes late. The president's chauffeur came over and picked up 5 papers for him this morning." So the president reads the newspapers himself. He reads several major Eastern papers in the morning. He reads a local paper here in the evening, and the LA Times, which comes in a little late. I think it gets here about 11 o'clock. The president's always got an opportunity at noon to read that. So these would be the newspapers that he would read himself, but this would serve as a substitute if the president felt one morning he didn't want to read the papers or he wasn't reading the papers. He can get it all out of here, but he uses the papers and uses this as a supplement, basically.
It's a supplement?
Supplement to the normal daily reading of the president.
Tomorrow, when Earl Mazo continues his conversation with Patrick Buchanan, the presidential assistant tells how President Nixon reacts to news stories and how the president requests special reports on what Buchanan calls media trends concerning administration policy. That's tomorrow night in Part 2 of Earl Mazo's conversation with Patrick Buchanan. Ford Rowan, WTOP News at the White House.
Muhammad Ali has decided spokesman.
This evening, the second in our exclusive series of reports on how the president follows the news. Presidential Assistant Patrick Buchanan, who edits a 4,000 to 10,000 word summary for President Nixon every day, discusses with WTOP commentator Earl Mazo how the president reacts to the news.
Suppose he sees some reference in your summary to something he might want more of. Does he send?
Well, the president, then you'll get a message from the West Wing saying the president would like to see a full copy of the following articles, and he'll have a list of them. We'll send them on over to him. When he calls for these columns and editorials, very often he'll read the full thing and draft a note himself to the individual editorial writer or the columnist who did it, saying that he agrees with him or he disagrees with him for this or that reason. So it keeps him in touch with the people beyond the Potomac River.
How about the anger and the frustration?
Well, these...
blow up?
Well, you don't see, as I say, he does everything through memorandum. He makes notations on the news summary. Sometimes he feels an article is not well informed. He'll direct Herb Klein or maybe Ron Ziegler or someone else to call in the correspondent and fill him in on our position.
How about those articles and columns and whatnot which refer to something specifically of note in the government somewhere that should be done or isn't being done?
Right. Well, this is when you bring to his attention a lot of material, of course, it's in the media that's critical of the cabinet sometimes, critical of administration policy, critical of individuals. And the president, on the basis of this, will send out directives and memos asking for a full and complete explanation. Is this accurate? Is this true? And this has been done any number of occasions. As a matter of fact, it's one of the main outgrowths of the president's daily news summary.
Can you cite anything specifically?
Well, a positive one. ABC started in January, late January or February of last year. They brought to public attention the black lung disease. They had a number of films on it at night. They'd sent a crew out to West Virginia, and we brought this to the president's attention. And the president saw that, and a directive went out to Interior Department, and they began stepping up, and as a result, I think a good deal faster and a good deal more comprehensive bill on black lung disease was sent up to the Congress. Similarly with hunger, we would tell the President that the networks are focusing on this hunger issue, and they've had a good deal on it last night, a good deal the night before, and the President right away would send out directives, let's move on this issue, you know, it's a matter that's being brought to public attention. The networks perform a great, a service in bringing it to the attention of the public, and I think we can help a good deal ourselves by taking it off there and turn it into the President, who can act on these things right away.
How about some negative things? Do you ever called anybody to task in the administration because of something that they did wrong that you learned from the summary?
Yes, he has. A number of directives are going out, but I wouldn't want to mention any individuals.
On the basis of all that, you certainly must pretty well get the bounce back of the President's reactions to various things. You know, at one time, President Kennedy threw the White House, threw the Herald Tribune out of the White House because of some stories. Does the President get that forcingly?
No, he hasn't directed us to drop any newspapers from the news summary, no.
I don't mean that specifically, but no. What is his reaction, for instance, to the coverage, overall coverage of its latest Supreme Court appointment as compared with the Hainsworth?
Well, this is interesting because this is what the President makes direct requests for. We haven't had one on Judge Carswell yet, but from time to time the President will send a directive to me and he'll say, I want a separate editorial analysis done on how the State of the Union speech was received, or how the Hainsworth appointment is being handled in the media. And I'll take you over there across the hall and show you. We maintain a tremendous volume of files and news stories, and from all over these papers and magazines, and on those occasions we'll sit down and spend a day going through them, reading them, and doing something like a 20-page analysis of how this particular issue is treated nationally. Now, he'll make these calls from time to time. In addition to this, we do a media analysis for him every 3 weeks. We take all the news summaries we've gotten together for 3 weeks, and we take the columns and editorials on the major issues of the day. We've got them stacked over there now. And on the basis of these, I sit down and spend the day reading and do an analysis of various media trends. For example, if the Vietnam issue is heating up in the media again, you can read all these columns and editorials, you can read these summaries, and you can see it. It's visible, just like an ebb and flow of the tide. And we'll do an analysis for him of about 10 to 15 pages on major issues, how cabinet people, for example, are being treated in the media. If suddenly Secretary Hickel's in trouble because of the Santa Barbara oil slick, or a number of newspapers are critical of him, we can detect these trends by reading enough papers and magazines and journals all around this country, really.
Now, for more than a year now, you've been reading all the newspapers, having access to 54 newspapers, all these magazines and so forth. No other human being probably in the history of the world has had access to so much. As a former journalist, as well as assistant to the President, do you think, in all fairness, that the media as a whole has been covering the administration adequately and fairly?
In terms of fairness, the press, I would say definitely yes. There are some newspapers that have their own ideological bias. Let's take the New York Post and the Chicago Tribune. They speak from two different viewpoints. I think the President, by and large, with the majority of papers that are in the middle, that are non-ideological one way or the other, on balance, he's come off very well, and I think they've been both objective and fair. In terms of television network coverage, I would say that in my personal opinion, there's one network, which I won't name, which is, I think, consistently not fair or not objective with regard to administration reports. I won't name it, but the other two I would say are.
Tonight, the third in a series of exclusive reports on how the White House keeps track of the news. Last night, Presidential Assistant Patrick Buchanan said he thought the press and television generally have been treating the administration fairly, with the exception of one network, which he refused to name. Tonight, Buchanan, who is in charge of keeping the president abreast of the news, talks with WTOP commentator Earl Mazo about the effects of Vice President Agnew's recent speeches on television news.
You could sum it up, I think, this way. I think subsequent to the Vice President's speech, calling on the networks to check on themselves, to analyze themselves, there's been a conscious, deliberate effort to be more objective and to be more fair in all their reports.
Even by this one network, you say, which is still unfair?
I would say there's been, yes, by this one network. I could think of specific examples, but I think this one network continues to be consistently biased toward the administration.
You, of course, know that you've been credited or blamed, whatever way you look at it, as a writer of one or both of the Agnew speeches. Now, just a few days ago,
First, I wouldn't, if that would be true, I wouldn't consider it blame, but the speech in Des Moines, the famous speech on the media in Des Moines, and the one in Montgomery, Alabama, both of those were the Vice President's products from beginning to end, and I think that most of the individuals in the network and most of the commentators have focused on what the Vice President said rather than trying to say, well, how did this come about, where did this particular sentence come from, and the like. The Vice President made his case. It stands there on the record, I think. It's his case, and I don't think it's fruitful or useful or relevant, really, to find out who did this piece of research, who dug up that quote, or who wrote that line.
You say you didn't write the speeches then?
The Vice President. These are the Vice President's speeches. I, as Ron Ziegler said, may have contributed some thoughts and ideas.
An iffy question, as Franklin Roosevelt would say, but I think a legitimate one in the light of recent events. If, for whatever reason, Vice President Agnew were to make another speech directly at the press within the next few days, or say next week, what would you recommend as its scope and tenor? In other words, would it be critical, and if so, where would the criticism be focused?
If he spoke again on the national television, I think he would talk about just discuss the content of the programming. I would think that would be an issue to hit, but I wouldn't hit the same one he'd hit before, because I think he's said what needed to be said.
Just for the follow-up on this thing, because Eric Sevareid is, I guess, perhaps one of the senior commentators now on the networks. And just a few days ago, on February the 3rd, Sevareid sort of snapped back at Mr. Agnew in a speech in Hollywood, and he declared, among other things, and this is a quote, Agnew, Herbert Klein, the White House Director of Communications, and a speechwriter named Buchanan, who wrote it, are professional propagandists who accused us of being propagandists. It would be the biggest joke of the year in normal times, but now it is taken seriously, and I feel as though a pail of garbage has been thrown at me. Now, what is your reaction?
Well, it's a belated reaction. I think it's something of an overreaction. The Vice President's case is on the record. It was made in November. I don't think he threw a pail of garbage at anyone. What the Vice President indicated was that there was he thought a set point of view predominated in the networks. He put his case on the record in one night. The networks have had 3 months since then, night after night, of TV news and commentary to put their case on the record, and I think they have. And the people, I think, have judged it, if we go back to those polls that you were talking about earlier, and the people tend to agree that the Vice President had a point. I think that to talk about the Vice President throwing garbage at the network is really, well, it's sort of an overreaction. It's not really to the point. Again, it doesn't deal with the issue the Vice President made. It deals with something that's not there.
Mr. Buchanan, in Mr. Sevareid's speech, he also said something that has been debated about from time to time. He said that the television networks should not grant a president free time whenever the White House requested it. Now, do you agree?
Well, my view on that would be this. The president, of course, is the elected representative of the American people. In order to exercise his leadership as president, he's got to communicate with them. What I mean is that when the president, I think, has a right to speak to the people who elected him, his function as President of the United States can't be fulfilled unless he can communicate with the people. So I think the president has a right to go on national television when he determines that the national interest dictates that he communicate with the people and win their support.
By this you mean any president?
Any president. And if it's a partisan case he's making, then I think the networks have an obligation. I think they do provide equal time. The President of the United States, when he speaks to people, he's speaking to 30 million people who elected him. He's speaking probably once a month. Now, Mr. Sevareid, of course, for his, on his behalf, he has the half hour of network evening time each evening. And you ask yourself, who elected Mr. Sevareid? For Mr. Sevareid, or for anyone to say that the president has no right to go on the air and speak to the American people, then in turn you would ask them the question, by what right do you go on the air every night and take a half hour of network time?
Well, you raised this as to who elected Sevareid, and well, my reaction is that I presume that's the people who hired him.
My question, who elected Mr. Sevareid, is really, in effect, it's a rhetorical question. I'm asking, by what right would the president not have a right to speak to the American people, and yet these individuals speak to him night after night? To get into the basics of what Mr. Sevareid said or says on television, I think he's got certain responsibilities that are imposed upon television newsmen who speak to 26 million people a night, which are different from those imposed upon television. There is a difference there. For example, the provision for equal time. No newspaper is required to give equal time, whereas a network is. So I just think there's a difference between the two.
One last question, Mr. Buchanan, to in effect paraphrase someone who Mr. Nixon met on television quite often. Would you say that President Nixon is reading more and enjoying it less?
No, I'd say he's just reading more. I think the president's coverage, as I mentioned earlier, is good, fair, balanced in the news reports, and I think he's doing quite well. So I think he's reading more now and still enjoying it.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan.
The series of interviews with Presidential Assistant Patrick Buchanan was conducted by WTOP commentator Earl Mazo.